In today's lecture, we're going to go over aspects of Chapter 13, the Baroque instruments and the Baroque Suite. And so that we don't get blocked by YouTube for using recordings of great performances from there, you will find that there is a playlist that I'll ask you to pause my video, open up a new tab, and go and watch. So let's do a share screen real quick, and I'll show you where that is. So if you're in the course modules and you go to October 16th, there will be a PDF to download and look at, and then things that are playlists, videos for you to watch. It's really important that you actually listen through the whole entirety of these things and give yourself a chance to really absorb the sound and physicality of how these things are played, so that it's more than just a passing, oh, I saw a list in a textbook. The first thing I want to do is direct you to this PDF right here. And when you open it up, it's a questionnaire to help you see some important questions to be answered. And make sure that you have straight. These could be on your unit test and certainly could be in your chapter self-quizzes as well. Some of this we've already gone over as well, and you can fill this chart out. So download this and print this, but this will help you sort of orient yourself around some Baroque isms, especially that have to do with instrumental music, which is the chapter 13 and 14. So, answer these. What's equal temperament? See if you can summarize from the previous video explanations. What did it do to change music? I'll try and point some of those things out as we go along the way. Terrace dynamics. What's basso continuo and who plays it? We'll maybe talk about today. What's figured bass? What's it for? What does a Baroque orchestra look like? There's actually an example or two in the videos that you'll see. And what are the most popular instruments in the Baroque period, which is where we're going to pick up. And then as we get into these, the concerto, the suite, and the fugue, and today we'll talk about the suite, you can start thinking about lists of things that are attributes that would describe it, but also, what might come up on a test. So there's that. Let's go to the book right here. I tried to highlight in yellow. If it's not perfectly in focus for you, of course, you have your own textbook. The first thing is that there were two really important keyboard instruments, the pipe organ and the harpsichord. And, the pipe organ, actually, the organ itself as a mechanism and an instrument was around from the Renaissance time, but it was small enough that somebody could just pick it up and carry it, or they could wheel it around in a cart or a wagon. The pipe organ gets bigger and bigger in church installations where they keep adding extra rows of pipes and bass notes and things like that, and extra sets of manuals, or what a keyboard looks like. Manuals are the keys, and you'll see more than one row of those because they can all be assigned to different pipes. So you have duplicate pitches, but they can be given different colors or even octave ranges and things like that. At this point, you should definitely go over here and start the listening by looking at Little Fugue in G minor by Bach. By the way, this whole thing is Bach, and more Bach, because he is the representative composer of the time. He's the person that exists at the end of the period, so he has a mature style that he's working with that's been established, and he's truly the greatest master, perhaps, of all that time. Although at the time, he wasn't considered famous or anything because he was a composer. In fact, we'll also look at another person, Handel, that wrote the Messiah, who was extremely celebritized and wrote for kings. And if you had said to Bach, who's Handel, he would know exactly who he was as a composer. But if you said to Handel, who's Bach, he might have thought for a minute and went, oh, wait, I know who that is. That's that organ player that's quite good. And that's true. Bach was a virtuoso organist, and he worked for the the churches where he lived during the parts of his life, and he wrote music, and it's Handel is much more accessible. He knew he was writing for aristocracy, and it needed to be something that would engage them quickly and be popular, memorable. Bach wrote mostly for church, and he was highly religious, and he wrote for himself as well. And it's much, don't get me wrong, Handel's no slouch. He's a genius in his own right, but Bach's music has sort of risen to the top of everything. So you don't get enough of it in this book. So these examples will all come from Bach. So go ahead and take a look at the video of the little fugue in G. It's a few minutes long, and I will stop talking, pretending that you have gone to do that. Pause this. Okay, so hopefully, that was more elucidating and instructive of what it looks like to play an organ. All the really, really low notes were being played by his feet, and some of the angles in there, you could see that as well. So organ was very important. It was like the sort of monster establishment keyboard. If you wanted power, if you wanted grandeur, you used that. Now the harpsichord, is it's like a small keyboard where a plectrum or a quill plucks the instrument's strings. You'll see two sets of manuals on most proper harpsichords that are built to look like replicas. And what happens is you play the lower ones, the keys, and that plucks one set of strings. But if you'd like to double down on the sound and get it louder, you can engage the top keys, not to be played separately, although you could do that, I guess. But what happens is you can engage them so that when you play the bottom set of keys, then it will also link up and make the upper set equivalent keys play and pluck other strings, so you can double the sound power that you have there by having two strings plucked at one time. Go ahead and pause this now and go over and have a listen to the Prelude in E flat major by Bach. All right, now if you take a moment and think about this music versus what we were doing in the Renaissance, we're in a completely different world, and this has a lot to do with equal temperament that we talked about, allowing you to play chromatically. I mean, all the different keys. Notice now that the pieces are named not only for what they are, but with a key that they're in, right? Little fugue in G minor, prelude in E flat. You'll see that again and again as we go through a lot of these pieces. And notice they're all different. And this is because we have a new tuning system that allows this. And if you listen really carefully in the middle of these pieces, they go on for quite a while. They take great pride in changing what key they're in or what tonality they're in, this idea of modulation in the middle of the pieces, several times actually, before they eventually migrate their way back. Okay, so then the next one would be the Baroque flute or recorder. This is the thing that the kids in elementary school, pay a couple dollars for and then get to play. You've probably gone through this experience yourself and done recorder karate. This instrument, that's sort of the straight flute, goes way back to pre-Baroque into the Renaissance, and even probably before then as well. It was considered a most excellent of instruments. It's sort of been demonized now by children blowing them really loudly, but in skilled hands, they're an amazing instrument. So here is a concerto that was not written originally for a recorder, but it was transcribed by the soloist here. And go to this next, I guess, number 3, Baroque flute, the recorder. And the first 6.5 minutes is the ensemble playing on their own. So go ahead and skip ahead to 6:41 and listen till 10:24. And hopefully you will be amazed because it's such a commonplace instrument today. But it's a brilliant and amazing thing. when played professionally on a professional instrument. So take a moment there. Okay, hopefully that was, made a new favorite for you, made you an enthusiast. I want to point out that the continuo is being played there by the harpsichord and the lutist and the lower strings as well. Remember that continuo or basso continuo means bass throughout, and this is a feature of Baroque music, especially instrumental music, that they had a profound, strong bass line. That doesn't mean like a funk line or something like that, but a prominent way of controlling the harmony and the rhythm and such. You write a distinct bass line that's sophisticated and has all those abilities in it. The chords are filled in by usually a harpsichord, and the other sustaining instruments like the strings and such would play the bass line. In this case, they have a Baroque lutist, and he's playing the continuo part as well. So also notice that the string players in that video had interesting looking bows. Instead of being curved inward toward the hair, it's curved outward like a bow would actually look like. And your book actually talks about this. Let me stop the share right here. When it talks about strings, it says that there were differences in the instruments, that the fingerboards were flatter, and the tension on the bow hair was less, and that they used gut strings and things. And that the bows were out somewhere like bending outward, looking like an archer's bow from where it got its names. And so that's what do we do today? Oh, well, most people that are professional violinists, unless they really specialize, that's all they do is play old style of music. They won't have an actual true replica of the Baroque instruments, but what they will do is they will get a Baroque bow, and that will allow them to alter their sound and play in a different way. So those are modern instruments you're seeing played with Baroque bows, and they're not from the Baroque period. They're a modern construction of something that approximates that. So there we go. I'm going to go back over to the share screen, and we're going to talk about trumpet for a second. So the trumpet, we think of trumpets as valves, and you've seen pictures of jazz and things like that. A Baroque trumpet actually looks more like a herald trumpet that goes straight out and loops around and then goes straight back out to the bell again. It didn't have valves. It might have had little holes at the very end that you could manipulate the sound a little bit with it, but there were these very, very narrow, thin tubed, what we call a narrow bore, that gave a lot of back pressure and allowed the instrument to be played higher. Also, the lesser amount of tubing made the partials in the instrument, the notes rise higher. It has a very different sound. And so here's almost nobody plays those. Nobody can play those today. You have to specialize in that. And so we have a recording of Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto played with a Baroque trumpet player and other instruments as well. Pause this video, go open this tab, and play this. It's just a few minutes long, this particular movement, and it's quite amazing. So enjoy and have a look at the interesting instruments that are being played as well. Okay, so this has got another example of the continuo section, which is the standing cello and the harpsichord. There's another recorder player who's playing one of the solo ensemble parts, although that's not a soprano recorder, that's an alto recorder, and so it doesn't have quite the lead sound. It's a gorgeous sound though. And if you look, there is an interesting instrument that it looks like a really giant violin that was hanging by a strap around a guy's shoulder. It's called a Viola Gamba. It's an instrument that was popular at the time. If you thought about sort of cello music today, it was written for the Viola Gamba. Today, and back then too, the cellists would sometimes play that and learn to play that. And so it would sit from the strap and hang down between their legs. They'd brace it with their knees and they'd play it kind of like a cello. There's another tradition where you take somebody who's a violist or a violinist and they hold the strap out sort of sideways, kind of like it's a lute, kind of like it's a violin, and then they bow upward. And that's what this person is doing as well. And so has a great sound and interesting look about it. We have another example that has a solo Viola Gamba player, which you'll get to hear it exclusively. The other thing is when we think about a Baroque orchestra, and I'm gonna go back, way back in our textbook, it says, here's the orchestra in chapter 6. We have this picture here of what an orchestra might look like. You think, wow, this is going to be big and impressive. But in truth, you could probably say that a Baroque orchestra at its biggest would be like 2 cellos, maybe a viola, 1 or 2, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 violinists. That's it, unless you had lots and lots of money, and then maybe you'd have the entire first row. But no more than that. Then add a harpsichordist, add maybe a lutist. That's what we mean when we say orchestra at that point. So the forces that you're seeing in these videos are actually pretty accurate, okay, in terms of the right size and such like that. So that can help you answer, like, what's a Baroque orchestra look like? Well, it looks like about maybe 4 to 8 strings and continual players, right? The harpsichordist or something like that. And that kind of gets us through the instruments right now. So you might want to just take a break at this point and pause this, come back, because we're going to dive into the suite now and talk a little bit about it. Again, you're going to use the playlist. The suite. A suite is a collection of things. In this case, a collection of short pieces, and they're based on historical dances. So dance music came up through the Middle Ages and in the Renaissance, and it was popular. And you're familiar with some kinds of dances, like you've heard of a jig, and you've heard of a waltz, and those kind of things. But courtly dances and evolved out of folk dances, and they were the way that people socialized and interacted with each other. In music in the Baroque period, what happened is the composers took, in essence, the qualities of each of those dances and the tempos, the meters, the gestures, those kind of things that would say, oh yeah, that's one of those kind of things, and then stylized them or concertized them, made like versions that you wouldn't dance to normally, but you'd sit and listen to for their compositional and musical value. But they still retained most of the basic attributes of that dance so that people would recognize it. Now, it's kind of funny because they're going to say suites were usually written for keyboard instruments, but then they're going to feature one that's got an entire orchestra because it's a famous one. And they sort of gloss over that and then say, oh, and this has, this was really big and had almost 20 different dances in it. So let me see if I can help you out to begin with by giving you a more common definition of like the average suite. A suite was usually a collection of 5 to 8 dances that were concerted or fancy versions, dressed up versions that were written for keyboard instruments, usually the harpsichord, but and that's, you'd listen to them as sort of a concerted piece. And the thing about the suite is that over time during the Baroque period, it evolved. It's a highly flexible and adaptable and robust format. For instance, Handel, who wrote for kings, wrote fireworks music and the water music for royalty. So King George had a day where he was going to take pontoon after pontoon and float down the Thames, and they had people on the sides cheering them on and things like that. And Handel wrote the music for that occasion, and they were on a barge behind the king, I think behind, maybe in front. They weren't right there though; they were a little ways away. And so instead of just having a keyboard, or just a couple instruments or something, he realized he needed bigger, punchier sounds, and so he has lots and lots of instruments and strings and things like that. And he's using more sort of percussive and louder kind of dances. And like it says in your book, the king liked it so much. The reason he wanted that, by the way, is so that it could be heard by the king, even though there was shouting going on from the river's edge by the people that were brought out to cheer for the king. And also he would be a barge or two back or three, so it had to travel the sound like that. Anyhow, you have an example of what's called the hornpipe, which is a very specific dance in your book, right there in the listening guide, and you need to get to know it really well. It will be an identification thing for your test. It's a great piece of music and so tuneful and so wonderful. They talk about suites being dances that are binary, and what that means is you'd have a beginning section. They're short, by the way. These pieces are 2 or 3 minutes long, and then it would get to here, and then it would go back and repeat that section again. We call this the A section, and then it would go to the B section and get to the end and repeat back to the beginning of the B section and go to there. And your book doesn't really talk about this, but let's relate it back to equal temperament and changing keys. If we were really interested in replicating and understanding these pieces of music, piece of music would start in a key, and by the time it was done the first movement, I know it would repeat and then go back again, that it would have, its job would have been to change keys to go to a different key. This is under the hood. You're not consciously aware of it unless you're listening and hearing those kind of things, but it is a function of what's going on compositionally. And then the B section winds its way back, sometimes through a couple keys or through a device where you have something that repeats again down a step and down a step called a sequence. And then by the time it gets back to the last phrase and it's going to end, it's in the home key again. So it's a little journey away and then come back harmonically. That can only have been done because of equal temperament and the ability to write in different keys and change in different keys and stay in tune. All right, so let's go back to your screen share for a minute here. And I have 3 examples of suites that I want you to listen to. The first one is, and again, these are all Bach all the time, okay? The first one is a gigue, which is the French pronunciation for a jig, which means it's going to be like a da 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 da. It's going to be fast and it's going to be dancing. When you listen to this, I want you to focus on a couple different things. One is that you'll see how extraordinarily complex and interesting and beautiful the music is. And this is clearly what we call dressed up, where they took the general kind of sound of a jig, but then made a concerted piece of music here. Okay, so that's the first one. The next one is it's great, imitative polyphony. It's actually something called a fugue. We're going to learn about that as a genre later on in another chapter. But one line comes in, and then when it's done its main theme, then another line will come in at a different pitch and repeat that or imitate that while this goes off and does a counter theme. And then another one will come in and so on, and they all mesh together like a puzzle. And the reason I want to point this out is because this stands in juxtaposition to when it said, what features are there in this era? And I won't put screens, but you can see back on page 102, it talks about homophony and says that we've developed a homophonic texture as being important. It's true. And we'll see that in lots of vocal music and other things too. But at the same time, imitative polyphony, it gets its own name called counterpoint, contrapuntal music. These all mean the same thing. Become highly developed and incredibly complex, and you'll hear that in this particular piece of music. You'll also see, because it's using the score for the video, that it gets halfway and then goes back to the beginning and then does the second section and then goes back to that beginning of the second section. So pause and enjoy the gigue from French Suite number 5 by Bach. Okay, so then the second example is a courante from a solo suite for lute. Bach didn't write too much for lute, but there are a couple suites that he did that are attributed to this. This is being played on guitar, which is quite common, sort of modern adaptations of it. And it's a different kind of dance called a courant, and there's a definition there. It's a running dance, and you can hear the rhythm has these folk things where you would run towards somebody and then run back. And this is one of the ways that they were able to interact, men and women, and socialize. So anyhow, and it's beautifully done on the guitar. Take a moment and listen to that. Good. Now, hopefully you saw the instructions to start at 6:47 because there's two other dances, I believe, before that. I think there's a Prelude and an Allemande, which are other things, but I wanted you to hear the courant. And now the final one of these before we leave this for now is another solo suite called a Cello Suite. Remember I said that the suite becomes a fairly robust format or genre. You could have the standard one, which is 5 to 8 dances, usually for harpsichord or some other keyboard instrument, or you can have it all the way up to a grand sort of, royally funded orchestra, and with lots of instruments punching out sound and things like that, and be quite long, up to 20 dances or even more, actually. It depends on your budget and your occasion, although this is the typical definition that you're going to want to know for the test. Solo suites for other instruments become, what can I say about them? As time in the Baroque period goes on and more of these are written, the composers start to explore and do interesting and different things. And the suite becomes incredibly expressive when you put it on certain instruments. And the way they wrote them are no longer these, I don't know, like flashy things, although they can be that way too. I guess what I'm saying is the suite also becomes increasingly introspective and unique to the instrument, allows you to explore the capabilities of the instrument, and it goes away from being purely entertainment to being more for the players in some ways too. So this last one right here, and again, you're just going to listen to the first of these. It's the whole suite. There's a bunch of these things in here, but just listen through the first one. Is being played by the Violet Gamba player. It starts with some cutscenes of the countryside that you're playing, but eventually you'll get to the person on stage, and he's wearing strapped, played to the side. This is, I guess what I'm saying is this has become so custom and specific to the cello or the Viola Gamba that in this case even it has a custom 5th string instead of the 4 strings typical of cello players, which allows it to go higher without doing crazy things up the neck, which modern cello players have to do to play this. Anyhow, like I said, it goes a very, very big difference that you get between the first jig that you played to Handel's hornpipe music that you will play on your own in Mind Tap to this. And so, the suite is not to be underestimated. These little dances are short little binary things. They have a simple format, but they can be customized with great effect for different things. And so highly adaptable and highly wonderful to do. Pause this and go listen to that. When you come back, we'll finish up. Okay, so what about the rest of this chapter? Well, I guess the first thing I want to talk about the rest of the chapter is Pachelbel was, a successful and important composer in the Baroque period. But he's not like on the caliber, quite honestly, of Bach and Handel and the other people like Scarlatti, and I think they talk about Lully, Corelli, Gabriele, Telemann, these people. But he has like perhaps the most famous song ever from this time period called the Canon and D. This is the wedding canon, Pachelbel's canon, and so it's there. And it has some interesting things. It has something called a ground bass or an ostinato bass that repeats itself, and then variations on things go on top. But it doesn't really apply to a big genre of music here. And so, you know, learn it, enjoy it. It'll be on the listening test. And now you know where it came from, and you'll know a little bit about it. Also, the sonata. Sonata is a funny word in music. It comes from the word sonare, which is to sound. And basically it applied to instrumental music as opposed to cantata, which is to sing or to have sung. And so, it gets applied loosely to a lot of different kinds of music, instrumental music in the Baroque period. If you write a solo instrument piece, you might call it a sonata. If you write for 2 or 3 instruments, those are sonatas as well. There's something called the trio sonata that has 3 instruments plus continuo, so it's kind of 4, but 3. And even then, they really vary by composer and time of the Baroque period as to what their content is. So, it's loosely applied to a lot of these kind of things. We're not going to spend a lot of time on the unit test trying to help you, make you define exactly what it is, because it varies so much. You will be responsible for an example of, and it's a good example of Corelli's Trio Sonata, just to understand that when you're hearing this is an example of, small ensemble during the Baroque period. It does say that they have, multiple movements. These are different than the suite's individual little pieces. And they are juxtaposed usually like fast, slow, or slow, fast against each other. The forms are different. The way that they're written are different. Anyhow, so it's not that there's not a lot of sonata music there, but as a standardized form as what it means, it's not done yet. When we get to the classical period, which is next, it will have crystallized into something very specific and very important, and then we'll study the classical sonata and the concerto, which is a solo sonata format, very, very closely there. But for here, just be familiar with what's in the textbook and the piece of music that goes with it. Right, and then other Baroque composers. I think the biggest challenge of any book like this is to say, well, who are we not going to study? And these guys are giants in history, and their music is amazing, and their accomplishments remarkable, but there's not enough time. So, there you go. All right. So take from here, anything that we covered is going to be fair game for the unit test. And those recordings on YouTube are very important for you to have listened to and to get a feeling for, so that you can say, I've heard this reminds me of this kind of thing, and think about the attributes and things like that. We are going to be sort of done with this chapter. We'll come back and revisit it to get some information out of it and organize it about instrumental music in general. Next week, we'll start on the Baroque Concerto and the Fugue and talk about those in more detail. And your chapter quiz for 13 will be due this weekend as well. So have a great weekend and enjoy getting through this chapter and sort of internalizing the details more. And we'll see you on Monday.